Hi everyone. My name is Shakil Rabbi, and as Dr. Rajendram said, I have a prepared recording. Uh, Again, I want to have that sort of just give my message out there as a recording, and then really open it up in terms of the Q&A. I think that's where sort of getting your mind around, okay, how can I use textual analysis for language research or education research would be more helpful, because all of this research methods or research questions are really situational. Like, you want to do this, how can I do this? How can I use this tool in this way? So I think that would be a better way of doing it. So I will just present my talk and do the screencast, and then afterwards we can have the conversation about this. Okay. And screen two, screen one. Which one am I sharing?
We see your title slide.
Okay. Well, let me stop the quick share. I think I didn't. Analysis for language research. Analyzing pluralical. The title of my talk today is the value of textual analysis for language research. Analyzing pluralical and translingual text in colonial societies. So in my talk today, I will discuss the phenomena of conceptualizations of language in literacy practices by Muslim Bengalis during the pre-early and high modern colonial era. My talk today will show that its language did not start out as a code for an ethnic community, but was a language of place, or Desi Bhasha. It shifts into the high modern era into the language of the community. Literacy artifacts that I show here show a diachronic development of plurilingualism on the one hand, yet modern language code ideologies on the other, that emerges in Bengali communities, Muslim Bengali communities during the 19th century. One of the issues of language research or language theories have been the view that language and the speech communities which define or delimit language is understood or takes on the feature of linguistic utopia. That is, it seems to talk about an idealized community that doesn't correspond to the actual language practices of the majority of people who use it. It is on the abstract, on the theoretical board, and all in terms of the idealized view of a formal system seen in the form of the language tree of Chomsky analysis. As Pratt, in the article that some of you have read today, talks about that, she calls it linguistic utopias. That is, an unimagined non-space where language is taking place. Another way that she advocates for, and sociolinguistics and rhetoric and composition and writing studies also approach, is this plurilingual and translingual framework that primarily looks at how language is represented in the way that people are using it in the world. So it is a way to address this gap, address this oversight, address this assumption, and this primarily aims at looking at how language is being used in the world. And when we go into plurilingualism and multilingualism and translingualism frameworks, obviously it looks at older models to recuperate the linguistic and language practices of communities that prior to modernity, and print modernity specifically, was talking and speaking and using language in a way that we would tag as plurilingual or multilingual or translingual. So this study or such studies can inform our understanding and interest of current translingualism or plurilingualism through the insights of transculturation, discursive fields, cultural hybridity, metrolingualism, etc. Now, important conceptualizations to think about whenever we are trying to study language in historical literature is this idea of the discursive field. That is, the definition of language or definition of communication or definitions of literacies that are clustered around different ways that those concepts are understood and conceptualized by their users throughout history. So as we talked about, that we have to think of it as different contested spaces where this idea clusters and different sort of alignments take place. The second thing we need to think about is contact zones, which are spaces where different cultures, different conceptualizations meet in unequal relationships of power. And the third is transculturation, which is where different communities use different practices and genres and literacy artifacts in different ways than the original intent to recuperate power, recuperate sort of the circulation that literacy practices afford. One of the things we can think about while we're also examining this talk is the use of textual analysis work for language research. So it provides textual analysis, provides empirical proof of plurilingualism that is not limited to grassroots literacies or literacies in the wild in the context of historical arguments. It is legitimate within language studies, I would argue, and also education studies, and needs to because it examines historical literacy practices of plurilingualism. Looking at textual analysis throughout literature and the published work from the last centuries, specifically in the spaces of the colonized areas, shows a way that monolingual dispositions have evolved, and it is contingent in terms of the historical developments of empire and imperialism on the one hand, and capitalist and print culture and Eurocentric nationalism on the other. In terms of explaining this or arguing it in the context of South Asia, specifically Bengal, which is the area of my talk today, I'll show that the particular language ideologies that developed in Western European societies associated with specific ethnic identities and treated them as markers of purity. But these ideologies around language are not evidenced in South Asia before colonization. Before colonization, there is little connection between language and community membership. That is, before colonization, language is not treated as a fixed code, but a mobile semiotic resource of communication. To evidence this argument that I'm making, I will point to two specific types of literature that existed prior to colonization and during high colonization. The first is the Puthi literature of Bengal. That is, it was a very common culture and literary performance among the Muslims of India. And one of the features of Puthi literature was its language, which is being termed a mixed language mode of Bangla, Hindustani, which was later split into Hindi and Urdu, Arabic, and Farsi. The purpose of the genre was to communicate Islamic ideas and culture to low-caste Hindus, animists, and Buddhist converts. So to illustrate what I mean by Puthis, let me just show this recording of a Puthi that was done by a TV channel back in Bangladesh. So this, again, is very purified and standardized and modernized, but it shows some of the moves that would be very common in Puthi literature. Obviously, this has been modernized, and this is much more explicitly about religious instruction than just cultural performance, which a traditional Puthi would have been. So keep that in mind. So if you had watched that video, you would recognize that the person is talking and reading and then explaining some of the terms to the audience. And again, the terms that he's explaining are Islamic terms and Arabic terms. And you can see the reader response aspect of it, audience awareness and uptake, all of those are fundamental to his communication and competence as a Puthi reader. The other genre we'll look at is called Nasihatnamas, which are books of religious instructions for Muslims. So as you can see in the picture I took on the right, you can see two texts, one after the other. And you can also see, importantly, that you have the original Arabic, you have the explanation or exposition in Bangla. You have the phonetic phonetic writing of the Arabic term in Bangla below, and then you have the meaning or the translation. Another important thing is you even have the vowels inserted into the writing, which is not how modern Arabic or even classical Arabic was written. You would not have written the vowels. The reader themselves in all Semitic languages produces the vowels themselves with their own fluency and competence. So the purpose of this was basically to standardize Islamic practices, and it's a work of literature, and most of it right now is the modern versions that you have here explicitly textbook version, but the original ones were narrativized. Another thing to be mindful of is sort of the historical and political developments that happened and how those are contextualizing or situating the literacy practices I'm talking about here. So in the East Bengal, or the area that is identified with Muslim Bengalis or now is Bangladesh, was originally established and settled by low-caste Hindus and Buddhists during the 16th century. So the specific areas that was settled and we identify as the Muslim parts of Bengal were actually very recent areas of human settlement. Once it was settled in the 16th century, the people who settled there converted to Islam because the power structure at that time were the Mughals. That was in the 16th century. So sometime in the 18th century, the battle of policy and the British colonization starts full on, when East India Company defeats the Mughals and becomes the main power in Bengal. And so under this time, the Hindus become the more powerful middle colonized subjects, because the Muslims basically retreated from cooperation with the British, and also because the majority of the Muslims in Bengal were really the lower class commons rather than the ruling class, who completely retreated and became sort of Muslim rulers who had nothing to do just but be vassal rulers of the British. The third important thing is the establishment of Hindu College, which was set up by the British in Calcutta in 1817, setting off the modernization of Bengal and starting off the Bengal Renaissance. So underneath this, you can see that the practice I'm talking about, the Puthis were very common in the 16th, 17th centuries and 18th centuries as well. So these were the originated at this time and continue. The Nasihatnamas, the modernist sort of literary revivalist texts, emerged in the 19th century, early 19th century, and late 18th century as Muslims tried to consolidate themselves as a group in resistance to the British Empire. And then you have high modern Bengalis between the late 19th century, early 20th century, who tried to position themselves as part of the literary culture of Bengal, and also because of requirements they had to communicate with the ruling literati classes, which were Hindus. And so you get this sort of sense that happens around this time. Again, this is a massive oversimplification, but it helps situate what the examinations I want to provide here. So during the first phase of the 16th and the 18th centuries, and the text during that time exhibited a sort of code meshing that was common in that time. So the tradition of Puthis, which is what I showed earlier, is a common cultural and literary performance among the Muslims of India, and they show that language ideologies of code meshing were very much extant at that time. Its development through the pre-colonial and high colonial periods also show that views of language began to shift in subtle ways, underpinning the establishment of language as a fixed monolingual code, even though among the grassroots and conventionally social underclasses of the common Bengali Muslims. So that is code meshing, or sort of a functional view of language, or language as a mobile semiotic resource, was what was common and practiced in most of the Puthi practices, Puthi texts in the 16th and 18th century, but that radically shift or subtly shifts in the late 18th and 19th centuries once colonization is in full swing. So here's some, on the right is an example of a Puthi writer communicating this idea of language. That is, he says, you just use whatever language people speak in the country, and God understands the language of any place. God understands all languages, whether it is Hindu or being a vernacular of Bengal. So the peers or the writers of the Puthis were actually cultural mediators, as some have terms, of this early modern, pre-modern era, and their main aim was to communicate the culture and cosmology of the true religion to the new converts. So Puthis was one way they did this, where they mixed Islamic lore and Hindu lore, sometimes animist deities and traditions, together. So they rejected denials of local language to spread Islam, and they went for explaining it and using Bengali as they saw fit. You can see the type of practice that is happening in the quote here on the right. So on the left, you see the original transcribed Puthi text, and on the right you have the translation that I did. So the lines on the left, you have the non-Bengali words underlined, and and the words that are underlined are not Bengali, but they're a mix of Hindi, Hindustani, Urdu, Farsi, Arabic, whichever. So there are three types of code meshing that is going on here. The code meshing is on the level of language. That is, it includes Arabic words, Muslim, Hindi words together in the text. The second is the indexing of local media, idioms and culture. So you have the idea of Kama, the bow of Kama, which is a Hindu god, and then the lotus of the shore. So again, these are Hindu iconographies that are taking place or being communicated here. And in Islamic culture, there was never the figure of the sage as you see here as well. So these are mixing of cultural codes going on. And then again, you see the third form of mixing that's going on here, or meshing, is a generic form of the romance with the woman gazing at the man. So that is a mixing of genre itself. So you would never have a woman being the sort of protagonist of erotic desire, or not very common in Arabic literature. I might be wrong, but it seems that that is not a very common trope. But it is a very common trope in Hindu epics, where male figures were aestheticized and shown as objects of desire by women protagonists. So that is, once we get past the 19th century and with the British firmly in control, you get a development of a new genre that emerges, which is the Nasihatnama, or the prose directions of Islamic instruction. So by this time, Islam is very much part of the culture, and at the same time, Muslims are extremely marginalized. So you have a lot of peasant grassroots subaltern movements that emerge and explode around this time, fighting against British rulers and their Hindu middlemen. So around this time, there's also reactionary Islamicization that is happening, and you have to remember that Wahhabism also comes around this time in Arabia, and a lot of the people who travel to Arabia for the Hajj, which is a requirement, come back exposed and in view of the sort of textual literalism and Wahhabism that was dominant or starting to emerge as the dominant strain in Arabia. So the sort of Nasihatnamas, or the genres that come around this time, are explicitly targeted for communicating and codifying and purifying Islam as they saw it. Again, it's sort of a part of the wider revivalist movements that take place, and you can see on the right an example of 1878, which is a really late one, but it sort of communicates the exact same thing that would happen here in the Nasihatnama. So there you do see the term Islamic, or switch into Persian when it's Islamic, and then switch to Bangla when it is not. So it is not about articulating in the vernacular, which was the case or the rationale provided in the original state of the Puthis and the culture mediators. So you see the terms that are on the right that are all in Arabic. And then the Bengali I've translated into, or it has been translated by the writer into English. In this phrase, religious texts appearing in the 19th century were all written in standardized Bengali or Bengali. They criticized Puthis for shirk, that is, they mixing Hindu ideology and Hindu terms and gods and ideas with Islam, which is very, very serious criticism. And the Nasihatnamas were framed as responding to this to purify and revive the understanding of Islam. So another very prominent example of this, which I'm not going to show here, is the publication of a very important Nasihatnama, Jyotidal Masayal, by Muhammad Naimuddin, who was a very prominent religious leader of the early 19th century, who provides a direct understanding of Islamic rituals and laws from a Bengali perspective. So literary devices and poetic modes, which are common in Puthis, are completely replaced with polemical lectures and prose exposition. Again, the genres are transforming, not just the codes or not just the language. In the third phase, we come to a high modernist era of Bengali culture. So this is the late 19th century, and during this time, there is a very prominent novel that is published by Mir Mosharraf Hossain, the first Bengali Muslim novel that is called Ocean of Sorrows. So the audience for this is simultaneously Hindus and Muslims. And you can see that happening, that in this case, alongside the narrative itself, there are long asides to the Hindu reader. So as you can see on the right, where the writer explicitly says, at this point it is necessary to say something to the Hindu readership, that if I do not explain brief our marriage system, so Muslim marriage system, it will take some effort on your part, Hindus, to understand the wedding ceremony presented here. So it is two notable things that you have to understand is that this is a Puthi. This is a Puthi story that has been translated into the genre of the novel. So in this case, it is again a shuttling between a discourse of urban literates, that is the novel, and the rural illiterate communities of the Puthis. So you can recognize here that even though they are Bengalis ethnically, they might live in the same location, Bengal. There's almost no interpenetration of culture between Muslims and Hindus at this point. It is firmly divided. So a Hindu person would not know the marriage customs of Muslim Bengalis, even though they might be living next door to each other or let's say 10 miles from each other. It's a very different world that they live in. And Hussein recognizes that, and recognizes that there has to be an intercultural, international communication to recodify or re-articulate an imagined community of Bengalis. So to do this, as colonial subjects, what he does is always talk to Hindus, who are the literate community and who is the audience for this. So you can see this manifested in glossing all Islamic words and rituals here that he talks about, and this is just a listing of some of them. And it's always explaining the non-Bengali words as being used because there are no adequate substitutes. So again, it's internalized that logic that Islamic ideas have to be articulated in Arabic. But it again develops that idea by glossing the terms into Bengali for the Hindu readership. This gesture is very much an communal ethos of communication. It talks about this concept of internationalism, or what Nazwam have called cosmopolitanism. So it is important to understand that this idea of internationalism is not what we would understand as internationalism in the contemporary context. The idea of nations in the Tagore sense is a unified manifestation of the divine unity or the divine self, which is the Atman in Hindu cosmology, or the Tawheed in the Islamic cosmology. So whereas we tend to think about the Cartesian split in the self and the mind, there is no such distinction in Islam and Hinduism. It is all mind, and materiality is a manifestation of the mind in the material. And the mind here is divine. So this sort of communication and ethos is well perceived by Hindus, because the reviews of the book is relatively positive, and within a decade or two, Ocean of Sorrows becomes part of the canon of Indian literature within a few decades. Notably, it is the only Muslim writer who writes a novel and it becomes part of the Bengali Renaissance canon. Everyone else continues to be Hindu till the second half of the 20th century. So from these three examples and three phases, you can see the changing mindsets of language and literacy. That is, conceptualizations of language change into modern monolingualism over the course of colonization. You can see that originally language was prioritized religion or place. It became only about communities that are using it, defined by religion and literacies and monolingualism post 19th century. The literacy artifacts and the text evidence this change of language and literacies into codes, as you can see in the Nasihatnama example, rather than mobile semiotic resources, which is what I would argue is being used in the Puthis, and into a general internationalist ideology that also vies for the hegemonic modern conceptualizations of community in Ocean of Sorrows. So these are three instances of community that is going on here, and language and community relationships. So the literacy practices of Puthi approach communication and language functionally. That is, in terms of its overall purpose of communicating Islam to the local population. Its form of code meshing aligned with the universalist religious ideology. In the second instance, you have examples of literacy practices by the revivalist writers that evidence the change in the role and conceptualization of language into a code, and how that is a reaction of colonization. It is a form of code mixing aligned with the modernist nationalist ideology based on the community. Hussein uses this the novel form and literary Bengali, but he also speaks in an international, intercommunal context and purpose. So it is a form of plurilingualism aligned with the modernist cosmopolitan ideology. So it is using a conceptualization of language as code, yet it is also articulating a community that is intercommunal and international, rather than the sort of classic monolingual idea of nationhood. So all of this is to say that when we look at literature in a historical context, one of the things we should do is focus on communication in context zones, as someone like Pratt would say, because these areas of difference and contestation highlight these dimensions of language, these transformations of language, and the centripetal and centrifugal forces of language that are playing out. The discursive field of religious rituals and semiotics are especially powerful places to understand language and literacy. That is, there are places where literacy is highly invested in by their users. There's a high level of codification going on, and there's a high level of distribution of those literacy texts going on. So these are textual practices where a lot of information is being processed, and there's a lot of society being played out. It is not just situational, it is cultural. And the scale is therefore bigger. The highly contested spaces of literacies in religious communities are where you can see the different texts and sects and communities articulating different discursive fields very differently. So the idea of Puthis as a religious text is very different than the idea of the religious instructional text or by the revivalists, because those are two very different communities. Then the second thing that I think my presentation shows is that the diachronic approach to literacy practice of context zone shows practices developing and transforming across time. It shows that language change takes place through ritualized literacy practices and vice versa. And specifically, again, religious domains or global spaces where near and distant indexicalities impacted language and literacy users. So again, it is sort of a scale of operation, and specifically religious text in the South Asian context is a very complicated space of contestation and a very highly negotiated and stakes conversation. So this is again to say that textual artifacts, when we look at it, are key to understanding how people understood and used language, I would argue. The Puthis show that the Nasihatnamas and the novels show different instances of how language is conceptualized and practiced, and their role in the broader conceptualization of community throughout the generations. It also shows that it is developed through time and cognitive shifts that happen in literacy development. So the Puthis were a situation where coding and encoding was assumed to be interactional. So a person was reading and a person was hearing the person read, and you had to understand both dimensions. In the religious context of the Nasihatnamas, it was much more a direct relational information being communicated to from one point to the other. That is, it is a conduit metaphor that's happening, to put it another way. And in the novel sense, you get again sort of a hybridization of the conduit metaphor and the performative metaphor of language happening, or the articulate metaphor of language. That it is trying to create a nationhood that is international, and these conceptualizations are taking place within such a purpose. So finally, the examinations of literacy shifts from pre-modern to modern print-based contact zone can directly inform our understanding of print-based to digital literacy shifts happening now. So again, the era I examined, or the text I examined, map a shift of consciousness or a shift of literacy practice from the pre-modern and pre-literate to a literate society. And we are going through a similar radical shift of the role of literacy from a print-based to a digital-based culture. And looking at it in terms of this, or the shift that happened in South Asia, can tell us what sort of phenomena and transformations we have to look for in this current transformation into digital space, where the print-based and the conduit metaphor is simply not adequate to understand digital writing, which is much more articulative and networked and distributed and assembled. So things to think about in terms of our approaches to manuscripts and texts. So when we're trying to understand historical utterances, historical practice of plurilingualism, manuscripts are a very useful space or research resource. They are, again, nowadays increasingly available through digitization and therefore worth considering for examination for literacy purposes. They provide, again, another benefit is they provide a way to communicate with humanities disciplines. This is because manuscripts are the currency or the assumed common sense or common practice of the humanities, such as English, such as history, such as all these historical disciplines. Now, this is important because even as educators or even as language scholars, you will always have to work with English departments or humanities departments because you will have to talk to other departments to communicate or participate in the project of language arts education. The majority of language art teachers are English teachers or people trained in English. So you have to communicate with them and communicate with them in such a way that they would understand and could be able to translate into their own experiences, which is, again, an idea of manuscripts and an idea of humanities and classic texts. It is shifting, but it's still a dominant perception of how English departments operate. Manuscript culture can also be put into context into understanding their semiotic meaning. So it is impossible to understand manuscript culture without emic understanding because manuscripts are so situated, and reading it requires situational understanding at all times, just because of the very nature of the writing and the codes and the sort of cursive methods and the paper. You cannot really understand manuscripts without being immersed in the local situational culture. The third aspect is manuscript culture. Because of its, again, you are not privy to the immediate situation that it was written in. The only way you can properly understand and mesh yourself in that situation is by constantly comparing it to other manuscript situations. And that constant comparison creates sort of an ethic understanding of literacy practices. So a third position or a triangulated position comes up because you're always forced to compare manuscript cultures across contexts. So So in sum, these are the arguments I've made in this talk today. And the arguments I made here are basically based on these two pieces that I've written for this, and both of them are in the process of being reviewed. And that's it. I'm available, obviously, to answer any questions, and thank you for listening today. Okay, so I hope that people were able to follow that information properly. There wasn't too much mediation of technology on technology.
No, I think it went really well, Dr. Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry.
Let me just stop the